Why don't we start with the President of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. Richard, you somehow clarified in 140 characters or 280 characters the state of the Middle East right now, and unfortunately, and this is really unfortunate, I would not say this for most authors, but unfortunately, the title of your book keeps getting more relevant by the day. Talk about the Middle East with Donald Trump and America in full retreat. What does the Middle East look like right now?
What we're seeing in the Middle East, Joe, is essentially the post-American period. And I'm not suggesting everything was perfect in the past, but we had more influence than anybody else. And others, when they got up in the morning, before they made big decisions or did things, thought about how might the United States react? What might the United States do to us if we were to do this? And what's essentially happened now is we've largely taken ourselves out of the mix, and others are free to pretty much do what they want without deference or without really considering American interests or American actions. So we see the Israelis attacking Iranian sites in Syria. We see the Russians now, the most powerful external actor. They're the only ones who have ties to Saudi Arabia, to Iran. They're telling us what to do with Saudi Arabia. They've pretty much got the Turks under their thumb. We see Turkey about to invade Syria, going after the Syrian Kurds, who were our biggest partners against ISIS. The Saudis are prosecuting a war in Yemen that is a strategic and humanitarian nightmare. Iran is basically an imperial country trying to increase its sway around the region. And essentially, we've backed off, and we've said we don't need to be a central part of it anymore. What the president articulated yesterday was essentially a very narrow or pinched view of American foreign policy, based almost entirely on his view that if you spend a lot of money on foreign policy, it's money thrown down the drain. So this has now become a laboratory of a post-American region. And I think what we're going to see is increasing violence, no respect for humanity or for human life. And the rest of as bad as it will be in the Middle East, which still matters because of energy and terrorists, Israel, and so forth, I'm worried that our friends around the world are going to look at this and they're going to say, if it could happen there, elements of this could happen here. And they also are going to begin to prepare themselves for a time when the United States is no longer reliable. And that will be a very different world.
Richard, in the coming months, we're going to learn completely, or as completely as Robert Mueller was able to uncover, ties between Donald Trump, his campaign, the Russian government, and agents of Russia. I think it's fascinating and disturbing, without knowing the full details of what Robert Mueller knows and what the investigators know, that for the first time since 1973, Russia has been allowed to play a key role in the Middle East. And that would not have happened without Donald Trump's acquiescence. And now, with the retreat from Syria, with a very small footprint, but one that most generals I spoke with said was one of the most effective operations we've had, person for person, in recent U.S. history, that just increases Russia's power all the more, does it not? And now they're delivering threats on Saudi Arabia, a country that has certainly been in our zone of interest for decades.
Yeah, Russia's been the greatest strategic beneficiary, along with Iran. This began under the previous administration, under the Obama administration, when we wouldn't get involved in places like Syria. Russia got involved. And now for Putin, this is, in some ways, he's undone, I don't know what, 25 or 30 years of post-Cold War history, or one could even say going back longer. But he has essentially figured out a way on the cheap for Russia to re-enter the Middle East. Even people like Bibi Netanyahu, the embattled prime minister of Israel, spend more time shuttling to Moscow now than they do to Washington. The reason is he understands who is willing to act in the Middle East. You may not like what the Russians are doing. I don't particularly admire what they do, but they are willing to act upon their interests as they see them. And again, people are taking note. So what we're doing is essentially forfeiting our influence, and as you generously said, it's increasing the disarray in this part of the world. But Joe, I'm worried. What will happen? Don't you think the North Koreans are looking at this? How soon is it before North Korea will say, we'll denuclearize or do something on nuclear weapons as soon as you Americans start moving your troops out of South Korea? How will the Europeans look at this? This really is not just what's going on in the Middle East, but this is going to raise issues globally about what the United States is prepared to do. Foreign policy is never just about how much capacity you have. The president spent a lot of time yesterday talking about our beautiful military and how powerful we are, and he's right, it is that powerful. But what matters in foreign policy is also your willingness to use the power and the capacity you have. And what we're increasingly seeing is a United States that's not willing to do that.
Not willing to do that, and weakness, the sort of weakness shown by Donald Trump, the cowardice that he has shown, it sends a message. And you're exactly right, not just across the Middle East, not just to the Saudis, not just to the Egyptians, not just to the Jordanians and our longtime allies in the Middle East. It sends a message all across the globe. And you're right, the North Koreans are going to continue to back off on a deal, really, that really hasn't been given a chance to succeed. And Sam Stein, I want to play you more from the president yesterday talking to the troops, this time about domestic politics.
I don't know if you folks are aware of what's happening. We want to have strong borders in the United States. The Democrats don't want to let us have strong borders. He gave me an idea. Just looking at this warrior group, I think I'll say, I don't want the wall. And then they're going to give it to me. I figured out the solution. First Lady, tell Nancy Pelosi, I don't want the wall. Oh, we want the wall. And then we get the wall. When you think about it, you're fighting for borders in other countries. And they don't want to fight the Democrats for the border of our country. We want real offense and we want real defense, and that's what we're doing. We have secured a record increase to our military budget, and we are purchasing all of this great equipment. $700 billion last year. 716 billion with a B, with a B. And we were fought very hard by the Democrats and others. But I said, we have to take care of our military.
I really don't know where to start, Sam. First of all, so much for politics ending at the water's edge. Perhaps it hasn't in quite some time, but you don't see presidents talking like that. As I said at the beginning, Reagan didn't attack the Democratic speaker at the Brandenburg Gate. Ike didn't, attack Democrats when he was in Korea. But here you have a president, again, not only attacking Democrats in a way that's unnecessary, he's also lying, talking about the border, that Democrats don't care about the borders, when, again, I hate to just keep repeating the truth over and over again every day, because you would think that people would get it after a while, but some actually don't. We've had a negative immigration flow going back to Mexico for years. Hispanic groups were angry at Barack Obama for 8 years for being so tough on the border. The numbers have been low for quite some time, again, long before Donald Trump became president of the United States. He's just lying to those troops like he's lying to people that go to his rallies. But they're a captive audience.
Right.
They have to be there. How unbecoming.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me pause and thank Richard for that incredibly uplifting synopsis of American foreign policy. I was like crying as you were going through all this. Secondly, there was a weird dichotomy here. First of all, you're right, Joe. It's weird to see a president be that political in front of an overseas gathering of troops. There have been instances where presidents have gone overseas and they've made distinctions about foreign policy matters with their political competitors, but in this case, you had Donald Trump making purely domestic political points at an overseas trip. And notably, the first time he's actually visited troops overseas, which made it all the more remarkable. But what stuck out to me, and I guess maybe some other people here, is that, he's talking strictly about a threat, a security threat that is gathering at our southern border, something that he's materialized himself. at the same time that he is talking about how a security threat has been eliminated in Syria. And these two things don't really coexist. One, in fact, they're the exact opposite. The security threat is greatly over-dramatized at our southern border, and military personnel say that he is underestimating the threat in Syria. But this is what Donald Trump is. I mean, the one thing that I keep coming back to is that, you know, he's wildly inconsistent. He often tells lies. But on this stuff, on foreign policy, he has said from the get-go that he wants to pull back, that he believes that America spends way too much overseas, that we're overextended, we're overinvolved, we're overdependent on allies, and he wants to pull back. And for 2 years, he was stopped in doing that by the people that had surrounded him. Remember, one of his greatest early triumphs during the first year in office was the very limited bombing campaign he had in Syria, where he took out the runway of an airport. And that was done largely because he had people around him saying, you have to do this. But it's very evident, and it's become clear as day now, that he is now following his instincts on the foreign policy stage. And I'm with Richard. I don't think it ends here. He has been stopped in pulling back from our troop deployments in South Korea. Where do we go when there's no Jim Mattis to stop him from doing that? I don't know. It's an interesting and, for a lot of people, scary world down the road.
Well, and Betsy, he follows his instincts, but for most in the Washington foreign policy community and across the West, those are frightening instincts. This is a man who wants to withdraw troops from Syria because he doesn't see ISIS or Iran as a threat any longer there, or Russia, but he wants to send 3 times as many troops to the border and keep them down there for a threat that most of our Homeland Security analysts say does not exist.
That's right. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is a pivotal moment in the Trump presidency where he's very much jettisoning the traditional Republican and Pentagon foreign policy voices who thus far have been the guiding lights of his presidency on these foreign policy matters. And remember, this criticism that Trump is leveling at the way the global war on terror has been prosecuted is not one that Trump himself invented. The criticism of the way that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have dragged on for decades, getting to the point where children who weren't born on 9/11 are basically old enough to be deployed in Afghanistan. These are wars that have had extraordinary human cost, and many folks, particularly on the left, have been critical for years and years now that it's not something where we're seeing a payoff. That argument is not one that Trump is pioneering, but of course bringing that argument into the Republican Party is a huge shift, and this is something that challenges the basic bedrock of where the GOP is on these core foreign policy issues. That said, of course, there are emerging pieces of evidence that Trump will be able to find potentially a new demographic of people who do find this argument compelling. The Center for Strategic and International Studies released a report, I believe a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, finding that the number of Sunni militant fighters who are currently active in the Middle East and in the world has quadrupled since 9/11. And that's something that the people who are sort of critical of these wars are always, or have been, pointing to. That said, of course, the question of whether or not the United States should exert its influence in a muscular way in the Middle East is one that's been really simple for Republicans going back for decades now. And the fact that Trump is turning that on its head is kind of an existential challenge to the way Republicans think about foreign policy and more broadly about American leadership.
More broadly about American leadership, you're exactly right, Betsy. And unfortunately, we're seeing some Republicans, at least, we'll see what the entire party does, but we've seen Republicans sell out to Donald Trump when it came to deficit spending, selling out to Donald Trump on fiscal responsibility, selling out to Donald Trump on core values time and time again. Now comes the test to see if, as Betsy says, Republicans will adopt a position that, well, people on the far left have adopted for several years, for decades, in fact. We'll continue this discussion on the other side, and I'll be asking Eamon and Eugene who Donald Trump did not meet with yesterday and the implications of that when Morning Joe, Brady Bunch style, returns. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.